thanks very much to Oxford for Europe for inviting me, and also a special thanks to Dominic for his fantastic presentation. I've been frantically rewriting my notes a little bit because I knew that there'd probably be a little bit of overlap between what Dominic had to say and what I had to say as well. So excuse me if I'm going to come across as a little bit disjointed. Dominic has covered quite a lot of the most important ground here, so I'm just going to add in a few extra thoughts, and I'll keep it fairly short so that we have plenty of time for questions. And I suppose the main point I'm going to stress is that really what has happened in the UK over the past several months is nothing sort of absolutely remarkable, because we've moved from a position where a viewpoint that was really once viewed as lunatic fringe, I mean really genuinely lunatic fringe, has become governmental policy, and it's now the pathway that we're heading towards with very little to stand in the way. I think it's really important to remember that Theresa May, for all of her faults, and there were many, she did have a sort of central compromise or bargain that she was trying to pursue in her negotiations with the EU. On the face of it, Theresa May, in the political declaration that she agreed with the EU and presented to Parliament, on the face of it, she wanted to pursue quite a distant relationship, future relationship between the UK and the EU, outside the customs union, outside the single market, and so on. So on the face of it, a relatively distant relationship. But in reality, Theresa May's commitment to Northern Ireland, maybe to the DUP rather than to Northern Ireland, but her commitment to Northern Ireland meant that in practice, actually for the foreseeable future, the UK was going to remain relatively close to the EU in a large number of policy fields, particularly in the fields of economic and security relations. And in addition to that, not only in reality was she actually proposing a closer relationship between the EU and the UK for the foreseeable future, but she also negotiated both the transition period, but more importantly, the part to extend the transition period by an extra 12 to 24 months, because she did realize that the transition period in its 11-month incarnation, as it turned out, wouldn't be enough time to sort out a more stable future relationship between the EU and the UK. Now, we may not like how Theresa May governed, we may not like a lot of the things that she said and did, but her central policy was a compromise. Prima facie, a distant future relationship, but in reality, the commitment to Northern Ireland, stroke DUP, meant that it wasn't really going to work out like that, at least not for the foreseeable future. Now, by contrast, Boris Johnson's rejigging of that equation was pretty simple, but also very profound. Boris Johnson simply ditched Northern Ireland. Under his protocol, and it is his protocol, Northern Ireland is effectively separated from the rest of the UK for a great number of purposes. And not only that, not only is it separated from the rest of the UK, but also it's being effectively treated as a guinea pig for customs and regulatory purposes. It's going to be treated in effect as a sort of world first in trying to administer a dual customs regime in respect of the same territory, with all of the bureaucratic nightmare that goes with it. Let's not forget rather, that whenever Theresa May first made this proposal in 2018, it was Boris Johnson and his fellow Leave Ayatollahs who condemned it as untested, unprecedented, anti-competitive, a disaster, and so on. And yet that's exactly what Boris Johnson is about to impose upon Northern Ireland. But secondly, having ditched Northern Ireland, that did mean that Boris Johnson was free to pursue a genuinely more distant relationship between the EU and the UK. This wasn't just on paper, this was a genuinely more distant relationship between the EU and the UK. Now, we still hear a lot in the media and in a lot of the discourse about deal or no deal. You know, will there be a deal between the EU and the UK by January of this year? Will there not? I think we have to keep stressing in actual practice, it doesn't matter that much, because what Johnson is proposing, even if he got everything that he wanted, even if he got everything that he asked for the great majority of sectors and authorities and activities and people and individuals and businesses in this country, it doesn't matter. The difference between Boris Johnson style deal and no deal at all is minimal. And we can see that even today when the Commission published a reminder of some of the implications of what Brexit actually means in practice from the 1st of January 2021. deal or no deal, as the Commission said very clearly, it really doesn't matter to most of us whether there's a deal or not. Now, the other thing, of course, which Johnson has brought to the table is his total disinterest in extending the transition period, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the needs. And what that means, of course, is that the big event in Brexit was not really the 31st of January 2020, when the UK formally left the EU. The big event of Brexit will be the 1st of January 2021, when the UK actually finds out what it means to be a third country for the very first time. There's going to be a fundamental change in the UK's position in relation to the EU. There'll be a fundamental change in the UK's relationship with much of the rest of the world. And there'll also be a fundamental challenge to the UK's internal management and internal regulatory structures. And of course, all of that is totally besides the impact of the virus. Some of you may have heard me say it in a previous event, but you know, the impact of the virus is really the main reason for extending the transitional period. There were other reasons that could have been cited to argue in favor of an extension for transition, but really the unforeseen reason, but by far the overwhelming reason, was so as to prevent one crisis piling on top of another in a way which we had not planned for, in a way which, frankly, the government has shown no evidence that it's carried out any particular impact assessment or risk assessment for. And we are going to see in January the crisis of a no-deal Brexit pile on top of whatever the pandemic crisis, economically and in public health terms, is at that period. So I'll just finish then by asking, well, what is the strategy? And here I'm really going to echo a lot of what Dominic said. I think the first strand of the strategy is to make sure that the blame for all of this lies fairly and squarely at Boris Johnson's door. I'm going to make a point which some people might agree with, some people might disagree with. Certainly as an outsider looking in, this is how I perceive it. The current government isn't really a Conservative government, and the Conservative Party, which I look at, isn't really the Conservative Party which existed a year ago or 3 or 4 years ago. That's a problem, I think, for Conservative members and voters who want to see something like what the Conservative Party used to be, but I don't think it's fair to describe Boris Johnson's Conservatives as anything other than neo-Tories. I can't think of a better word to describe them, but they're certainly not Conservatives as I would have recognised them before. We've got to make sure that the blame for the consequences of these policies lies directly at the door of this neo-Conservative government. And the second point, I fully endorse Dominic's point. We've got to make sure that the UK remains a European nation and that the population remain oriented towards European values of liberal social market democracy. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, because clearly there is a significant part of the population that simply does not share that view and that vision. And there is another significant part of the population whose commitment to liberal social market democracy is capable of waxing and waning depending on the circumstances. So I think that's the second big challenge. I agree with Dominic on that. How do we make sure that the UK remains oriented towards European liberal social market democracy? Thanks very much.